Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Glen Maxey, Texas Democratic Party, here representing the Democratic Party and myself in opposition to Senate Bill 9. I'm going to try to talk quickly about three parts of the bill: the assistant part, voting center part, and the election contest part. In the assistant part of this bill, I'm concerned about the fact that we are adding something to the back of a ballot envelope. In the packet I've passed out on about page 3 is an actual size picture of a back of a ballot envelope, which is already too hard for anybody to read. I cannot read this. I must, with my eyesight, cannot read it. We're adding more information to it. There's no real estate to do so. So I am suggesting that we have an amendment suggestion here to take the assistant stuff off the envelope, put it on an extra form, and print on the envelope in bold. If you have assistants, fill out the assistance form. It will make the ballot envelope clearer for the other things that are on it, such as witnessing and the other prohibitions, and put all the assistant stuff on another form. Secondly, in the voting center section, 403, Mr. Bohock's bill was added to this, which does the mathematics of making sure that voter registration, voting centers match the percentage of voter registration. In that section, it says that you base that on the election day voter registration. Before a presidential election in 2020, tens of thousands, maybe as many as 50,000 in Travis County in past years, have registered to vote at 30 days out. They're not processed until 10 days before the election, and this is putting this circular argument that these election clerks have to set polling places based on something that we won't know until 10 days before the election when you do polling places months prior. So I'm suggesting we move that date back to 100 days prior. And more importantly, this thing says that you didn't balance, which means that in some legislative districts, you're going to take away polling places and add them in other legislative districts to get that all into kilter. So I'm suggesting in an amendment here that you not allow any polling places in voting rights protected communities to be closed, and you make the equity by simply adding polling places in the districts that need more.
Mr.
You
Maxey,
can add
please wrap
without
up your
subtracting.
testimony. Thank you very much. Members, any questions?
Yeah.
Representative Busey?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Representative Maxey, can you elaborate a little bit more on this bill when it specifically deals with that voting issue that we ran out of time right there, but I'd like to hear a little more about your concerns, because I know we had that Bohack bill and you talked about it, specifically how it could lead to an early snapshot that's not going to be representative of the electorate come election day.
Just to restate,
yeah.
You're doing the math after voter registration is completed, which is right before the election, which is months after you would find polling places. So we need to move that date. I would suggest 180 days prior, which is sort of in the end of May, which is all the voter registration for the primary will be processed. Then you get a snapshot and use that to set the polling places if you're going to do the mathematic formula. However, I think the mathematic formula is problematic because we've had a lot of testimony here and everybody agreed that we don't want to close a lot of polling places in the first years of these voting centers. I applaud Representative Click of moving up to 80%. Only 20% could be closed. But when you do this mathematics to make sure that in small counties that they're equal to the voter registration in proportion to the voter registration in each of the 4 commissioners' precincts, or in the large counties above 100,000 where you're doing it based on state representative districts. I've not done the math in any counties. I've heard in Harris County that this means that some legislative districts are going to lose 10 polling places and others gain 10 polling places. I am going to assume that when we do this, because there are many more polling places today with smaller numbers of registered voters in minority areas, this is going to have a pattern of closing voting centers in voting rights protected communities or having fewer there while doing the equity. You can keep equity, in my suggestion, by just adding more voting centers in the areas that need more to get to equity on voter registration percentages without closing historic voting locations.
I appreciate it, and thank you for this handout. Thank you.
Thank you. Representative Anchia.
Thank you. And first, I'd like to thank Chairwoman Click and Vice Chair Cortez for allowing me to sit at the dais today. And I want to be respectful of the members of the committee and not take up a lot of time. But Glenn, we've been working on voting issues for a long time now. I've served on this very committee for 6 years during the height of the photo ID legislation. And I see a full room like this, and I'm reminded of those days, of that, ultimately that bill that was struck down by a federal court and that we had to fix just last session. But we were in an environment with strict photo ID for 8 years, I guess, before the court sorted it out. And I'm consuming this in the context of, 10 findings of intentional discrimination by the Texas legislature against Latinos and African Americans. And this is not old-timey newsreel. This is contemporaneous. This is this decade, right, that we found these 10 findings by 3 different federal courts. And I'm also consuming this at the end of a session where, at the outset of the session, we had the Secretary of State that tried to purge 100,000 U.S. citizen voters from the list, right? Many of them would have been Spanish surname voters, maybe Asian voters, right? Our review of the list has indicated that a high percentage of those would have been new U.S. citizens. And so 10 findings of intentional discrimination against Latinos and African Americans by 3 federal courts, 100,000 people potentially purged from a voter list. And I'm chairman of the Mexican American Legislative Caucus, which is a bipartisan caucus. We're very, very concerned on the heels of all of that in 1 decade alone that now we are following it with this Christmas tree bill, which I think is a good way to describe it, that has some really good things in it, by the way. I think some things that all of us could get behind. But on a net basis, is it your assessment that this bill would make it easier or harder for people of color to vote?
I think this bill does make it harder for people of color, people that have traditionally been protected by the Voting Rights Act, to have their voting rights impeded. The section I just spoke about, while it talks about having equity of voting centers across a county to match voter population, I think its real intent on the ground to get to that place is will be to close voting centers or have fewer voting centers away from the traditional voting patterns of where people have always gone to vote. People of color in our communities will have their voting centers closed, where they will have to find new places to vote, be unfamiliar with those places across our communities. I think that's going to be the effect of it. While on paper it looks like it's just giving equity, and I'm all for adding many more voting centers in Anglo areas if the population and voter registration says that is needed, so there are not lines. But you don't do that with the risk of taking away access of voting in communities of color.
Do you think we have too many people voting right now?
I know we don't have too many people voting.
Isn't Texas still in the lowest quintile? Ever since I've been in the legislature, we have been in the lowest 5 of all states, even when we had a former Texas governor, last 10, I should say. We had a Texas governor who was running for president, and we came in at 42nd in the nation, right? And in this last election, we were 50th in the nation. And so I'm trying to figure out what we're trying to solve for here.
And I think that we have to put all this together in what's going to happen in a presidential year coming up. It's going to be a lot of interest in that election. We'll probably have the highest turnout we've ever had in Texas. Even though we've been poor, it's going to be a lot higher. And we are not prepared for it. We have now removed straight ticket voting, which has been an assist for people in communities across this state. In Harris County, for instance, where people will be marking a ballot, turning a wheel, unless they get new machines, turning a wheel, where the average voter has taken about 1 minute to go in, put in a code, and hit one straight ticket. They're not going to have to do that 80 times. If you do the math on that, a voter is going to be in a polling place for up to 10 to 15 minutes, where they were in there for 1. And if you just do the math, if you had a line of 2 hours on election day in a polling place in a presidential election, that is a 10-hour line. And that is voter suppression. And when you do these kinds of things of taking away the historical voting places, inadvertently perhaps, of people of color, and with those lines, and with the voter ID situation, and with on and on and on, we have a recipe for disaster of suppressing votes to a historic number in the future election.
Thank you. Representative Israel?
Thank you. Mr. Maxey, just to keep on this voting centers thing, this language is very frustrating to me because just as we're finding resources and ways to say, hey, your county elections officials are here to help you, the voter, with long lines and with the fact that you're stuck in South Austin and want to vote and your precinct is in Pflugerville. This language is coming to us at a time when I've never seen this legislature so hell-bent on nudging their nose into the business of county and local government. It used to be a little bit a bill here and a bill there, but it seems like we're doing it every week. And I guess I'm just saying that I'm in your years of experience that doesn't this take away the control of that county official who knows that the Asian market on North Lamar has a high peak and during this time, and this is a way for us to make it easier for people to vote. Doesn't it take those resources away by saying that it requires counties with less than 1 million people who use countywide polling places to divvy them up by registered voter and county commissioner precinct, when in this day and age we're dealing with a super region where people are traveling throughout that region every day and don't even know they cross the county line.
Well, my answer to that is yes, I think that we are being too prescriptive at the state level. We are a huge proponent of voting centers. They are better than sliced bread. They give people access to be able to vote where they are, where they work, where they go to school. It makes it much more convenient. We don't want to impede having voting centers anywhere. But I have said on many bills during this session, we should leave that decision. My position personally is not to close any traditional voting places when you have voting centers unless they are ADA non-compliant or they are just across the street from another traditional precinct place. Keep them all open, and I think that the bill as it came over from the Senate had that language in it, that we would, in urban areas, getting new voting centers, that we would keep all of the polling places open that are traditionally been there, and then just let voters go where they need to vote. This shouldn't be about closing centers at all. It should be about just allowing people to go what's most convenient to cast a ballot. So I would prefer taking all the language about closing them, other than saying that, raising the number to the 80% so that they still have some wiggle room to close the inefficient ones, the very small precincts because of redistricting, and those kinds of things could happen. But keep them all open. Keep as many as possible open and give convenience to voters.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Chairwoman Click?
Under existing statute, a county that uses vote centers can reduce the number of polling places by 50%. Is that correct?
That's correct, and that's way too many.
And which is why the language was added that would actually increase the number of potential vote centers in a high turnout election.
I applaud that.
Thank you.
Members, any other questions? Thank you to our speakers.